Hi, everybody. Denise Miller from SMARInsights with my colleague Sarah Ferguson. We're really excited to be with you today and see these case studies. I think it's always helpful to see how to use research in your day-to-day life and what it can do and how it can help make decisions and drive that decision-making process. And the topic today is an interesting one as more and more destinations are dealing with uh, disasters, natural disasters. We've seen many of them and more of them coming. So, how you can use data, how you can use actual research to make those decisions, I think is really helpful. So, we have two case studies today. We're going to start with Heather, who's going to talk about how they use some research around the LA wildfires, and then Marlise about the hurricanes and flooding. And, I think it's really important because when a disaster happens, there is so much pressure to do something, and, having that data to help you drive those decisions is really important. So I'm gonna turn it over to Heather and let her launch into, what they did at Visit California.
Okay. Okay, hopefully you can see my presentation. Yeah, lots of pressure to do something, but also a lot of questions about, well, what is the right thing to do? What should we be doing? How can we be helpful and not do harm um in the midst of a disaster? But how is it impacting the tourism industry, and what is the best role for a destination marketing organization to play? So I'm going to talk about the LA wildfires. I put together just a little timeline. This is something that happened back started January 7th of this year and escalated very quickly. I'm going to talk about, so the fire started January 7th. We fielded research January 22nd through 24th, compiled those insights from SMARInsights, because we then called an emergency board meeting that we held on January 30th. The research that we did helped inform both what we talked about and shared at the emergency town hall, and what we proposed the actions for us to take. And then, and I'll go through that, and then, later in April, we went back and then measured the impact of the marketing actions that we took, which again had all been informed by the research we did all the way back in January. With uh, Whenever a disaster or crisis strikes a location, you're going to have to deal with the news coverage and the media narrative, and suddenly everything about your destination that is being shown is related to the crisis. But with the media landscape now, on top of that, there's social media. And so, our team compiled some stats here. In the first 5 days in January that the fires erupted, over 300 mega influencers had posted over 550 times images from the fire to over 2 billion followers. So we've got the traditional news media narrative, but the social media, and because it's Los Angeles, because it's California, a lot of influencers actually live in Los Angeles, live in California, and so it just saturated everything in terms of these images. These are real images from influencers, but on top of that, we also had a lot of fake images that were further exacerbating perceptions. And, there was actually then news coverage about the fact that there were fake images. So there was really wall-to-wall coverage about what was happening, in Los Angeles with the wildfires. We were looking at a number of different sources. The first thing that really we are looking at as the crisis unfolds is media monitoring, which comes through our, um PR firm, social listening. Things that our research team is looking at more directly are our lodging reports, our STR reports. We look at Open Table to understand what's happening with the local restaurants. We also do look at mobile location data to try to understand some of the impacts on traffic. If you're available to attend GWTTRA in a few weeks, my colleague Graham G will be explaining a little bit more of how Visit California used some of those other data sources during this crisis. I'm going to focus on the custom research that we did specifically about consumer attitudes and perceptions. So, we knew that with the news coverage, there was going to be high awareness of the fires, but we went out and we determined what the familiarity was, both in the domestic market, U.S., but also in three of our key international markets: Australia, Canada, and UK. Domestically, 95% were familiar with the fires. There was a slightly less familiarity internationally, but basically 9 out of 10 people felt they were very familiar with the fires. That didn't mean the perceptions were accurate, but they felt like they were very familiar with the fires. So, however, they outsize their estimate of the fire impact when all you see are those horrific images of the fire. Across the markets, people estimated that the area of Los Angeles that was within the fire perimeter, and that was the language we used. Well, how much was within the fire perimeter or the burn area? People estimated 40%. Now, certainly there were larger impacts because of evacuations and smoke conditions, but in terms of the actual area of Los Angeles, the fact that people thought it was so much, and I'm gonna tell you how much in terms of, the burn area was a little bit later in the presentation, but this was an important part of speaking to our board to document just how far off the perceptions were. Because if this is the consumer perceptions, of course people are going to be canceling their trips to Los Angeles. Of course, this is going to disrupt travel. And so this clearly points to the need for us to take a very active role in consumer education. Another way of looking at it, it was we asked people to estimate, well, what percentage of Los Angeles tourism businesses or attractions would be open for business? And that estimate was pretty much people can do their math. So since they thought 40% was in the burn area, 100% minus 40 is 60. They pretty much figured that 60% of the businesses would be open, but that pretty much 40% would be closed. So their misperceptions were accurate mathematically, in terms of both what was affected and the businesses that would be open. We then asked about the impact on potential travel, and there was a significant impact in terms of making people felt that it would make them very unlikely to visit or less likely to visit. We looked at that both among in total, but our likely California travelers. We know there's a lot of people who just were not likely to visit California in the first place, so they actually have an outsize saying that they were not going to visit, but really they were never going to visit. We're mostly concerned about our likely California travelers and how big the impact was there. Because we asked this question in surveys over time, we have a lot of historical trend data. And so we were also able to look at that likelihood to visit California and compared to benchmarks. This is actually not likelihood right after the fires, but this is in the next 12 months. And we could compare that to what people were saying the year before. And in terms of future travel, where we gave a 12-month time frame, the good news, the silver lining is these these likelihood estimates were not that different from the year before. So we kind of came out of this wave of research feeling like we're probably going to see a really big short-term impact, but that maybe the long-term impact was not going to be as severe. But of course, our role in marketing and managing the message would play a big role in determining that outcome. this is another comparison back to the historical likelihood to visit. We also ask a battery of different attitudes towards wildfires, and what we were looking for here is understanding from the consumer mindset if we're going to have permission to market for tourism in the light of what was unfolding. And some of the statements that I want to point out were that we had high awareness about things like the best way to support a destination that has suffered from a recent natural disaster. Tourism is the best way to support a destination. The best way to help Los Angeles recover is to support local businesses and attractions. Destinations can suffer further damage if the unaffected nearby areas lose tourism. So those all had very strong agreement. And so that also helped reassure our board and our other stakeholders that we weren't going to do harm by going out and trying to promote tourism in an appropriate way, that there is a broad understanding that there can be secondary impacts from the loss of tourism after a disaster. And finally, the last thing that we really needed to check in this very quick research that we did is our advertising obviously is very fun and lighthearted. Is that gonna evoke a negative reaction? If we go out with our existing campaigns, which we're scheduled to launch our big spring push, would that be received poorly because it maybe is not the right tone? So we showed our full program of work, all our key assets, and again, we have benchmarks to compare it to, and we saw no deterioration in the positivity and no increase in any negativity. So we were able to again go into that board meeting feeling like we weren't taking a risk to continue our marketing efforts. So to sum up, we went in there with saying consumer education is key to address those misperceptions. We felt like there was a lot of short-term risk, but maybe that could be mitigated to the mid and long term. That there was an opportunity because travelers really do understand that travel can be a positive force for recovery, and that consumer sentiment for advertising remained high, meaning that we did have permission to restart our advertising.
Heather, you did not tell them what percentage of LA was in the fire zone.
Well, I have a slide for it later.
Okay, it's coming, okay.
Coming. It's coming. It's coming. So, because that was part of then our education effort. So we went to our board, and I want to clarify our destination is a little bit different. We are not funded through the government. We are funded directly through tourism businesses, through our industry stakeholders. And so when our CEO went to the board to ask that we um move some funds out of rainy day and we allocate some special funds for this recovery, that was not taxpayer funding, that was not government funding. We were not going to the state government or city government asking for any funds. We were saying, hey, tourism businesses throughout California, we want to use some of your resources to respond to this crisis. Even if you're not in LA, we think this is important to all of California. And so we presented a plan. We asked for the additional funding. That was at the very end of January. We used the research to inform what that plan would look like, multiple layers, including what we call a Calling All California layer. Our mandate is we market outside of California. um, we do national ad buys, so we inadvertently market to Californians with our national buys, but we don't specifically really have a communication message to Californians except in time of crisis and except when the board approves that. So the board did approve that we would do an in-state call to action because we felt like in the short term we could really drive Californians to show love to LA, and then our drive markets before we then moved out to a larger message. Okay, here's that map. So and again, all of LA was impacted. It was a very emotional and traumatic time for the entire city and region. But in terms of where our tourism assets were, we created this map that was used in different communications on our own channels where the little, yellow POI markers indicated where our tourism assets are that most people would want to be visiting, like the Hollywood sign, which was not on fire, Universal Studios, all these different LA attractions, and the shaded areas are the burn areas, of the Palisades and Eaton Fire, and so you can see where those were, and that the vast majority of Los Angeles, it was 98% of Los Angeles County was not within the burn area. Again, that's not to say that 98% of Los Angeles didn't feel impacted, but in terms of tourism assets, 98% of Los Angeles, was not impacted, and all of those businesses continued to need to make sales and to need visitors in order to pay their staff and to stay into business. Especially restaurants, have such, small margins, they can't take days and weeks of losses and without really starting to, be at risk. So we put those messages out through, we call it our California Now network, all of our different owned channels to push out an educational message. We really leaned in. There just coincidentally was Restaurant Week at the very end of January going into February, and restaurant stakeholders had specifically come to us asking for support and help. And so we leaned into doing a Dine LA messaging, and we were able to incorporate a part where part of that also collected funding for direct fire efforts and recovery efforts to those who had been displaced. We activated in-state social and native. We did an in-state and regional visitation message, out of home, as well as a lot of display banners, really encouraging people to come play and show their love to the Los Angeles area. And then an opportunity that we would not have normally done, but because the Oscars were, I believe it was March 3rd, we were able to negotiate. It is, a special, series on the red carpet, and also we were not planning to launch our national ad campaign as a part of the Oscars. It's usually a little bit cost prohibitive, but we were able to, secure that so that we could launch, we had a new spot that showcases all of California called our Road Trip campaign up around the bend, and so we ended up actually starting that as a part of the Oscars. And then also our partnership with Dotdash Meredith, we were able to put out a special edition People that really showcased California. So again, we're trying to fight all those stories in 24/7 news coverage that made everyone think that LA was entirely engulfed in flames, and to tell the message of remember that there's so much about Los Angeles, and to encourage people to remember all the things that they love. Okay, so we did that, and then we normally measure our return on ad spend at the very end of the calendar year, but we wanted to measure this specifically the in-state and regional drive market short-term visitation, which is what we were really trying to shore up that February, March, April. So at the end of April, we went into field. This is just a reminder of what incremental travel, the classic research design that we use, where we're only looking at the increment among aware travelers. We subtract out any rate of travel among the unaware. So we did measure our full program. Our full program, California and the drive markets achieved a 70% awareness, but we were really just looking at our fire recovery efforts, which netted out to 58% awareness. The Oscars was a huge opportunity for us and let us reach 40%. And this is just domestic and again, the California and drive markets, but the Oscars really let us reach an international audience too. All told, what that research found is that through that April time period, we were able to drive 280,000 incremental trips, almost a $1,400 per trip spend, which netted out to 385 million in impact. And that we were then able to take to our spring board meeting to close the circle and report back on those efforts. Of course, a lot happened in the world after the wildfires, which have led to new and different crises for our tourism industry. But the topic of today was specifically LA wildfires.
Heather, there was one question. I'm gonna take a minute before I let you start, Marlise. Whitney was asking, have you done any examination of the best messaging content approach to drive spending or support for tourism partners? Like the messaging, which I think we did when we did the original wildfire research a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it also it depends on the audience. The special messaging that we created. And it's so it depends. So for us, California is such a populous state. We even though we don't normally market in state, we've tapped the in-state market in crisis. We tapped our in-state market during COVID. We've tapped it during other crises. So there we really lean into a little bit of like civic pride, like pride and love for California, which we do resident sentiment studies that shows that's very high. Um, uh, uh, California gets a lot of negative coverage all the time nationally, but Californians largely we love California. And so we tap into that with this message of help support California. So if it's a different message in a wider audience, then I think it's a little bit different message. But we do speak to Californians in a slightly different way when we do bring that in-state calling all California message out.
Okay, I'm gonna let Marlise start, and then we can always take questions again at the end too.
Okay, it is so nice to be with you all today. Hopefully, you could see my screen. Give me a thumbs up, Denise. You see? Yeah, okay, good. All right. Okay, so good to be with you all today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Hurricane Helene, which I'm sure many of you have heard about or recall, but if not, we are going to see if my slides. There we go. So I just thought I'd start with a little bit of a background on Hurricane Helene. It hit North Carolina in late September of last year, bringing just incredible destruction. We do estimate that it's responsible for more than $78 billion in damages, though I think that number is fairly conservative. Over 30 inches of rain fell in 48 hours, and there were more than 2,000 landslides. So tourism is important to North Carolina. It's important to all of us, but to the mountain region of our state, to Western North Carolina, Q4 is particularly critical. Nearly a third of mountain spending occurs in that fourth quarter. These are 2023 numbers. But the majority of the spending does occur in October from the quarter. So our early estimate there as visitor spending losses, just based on the previous year, would be in excess of $2.1 billion. Obviously, the media was very focused on the devastation right from the start. At Visit NC, we did, and I hear a lot of parallels from what Visit California did, but we immediately paused all advertising. Even in the areas of the state that were not affected by the hurricane, we knew that it was not the right time. It was not sensitive for us to do that. We did make assessments on a daily basis to understand when that appropriate time to support these areas, especially those that were open, and other areas as they came back online. And we worked hard to balance that interest of partners across all of North Carolina's 100 counties. So our paid social was also paused while we did continue to monitor and evaluate the organic on a daily basis. The organic messaging that we did shifted to being more supportive, providing access to resources and encouraging those who are willing and able to contribute to those recovery efforts. We also assessed news coverage as well. So 89% of the coverage during the week after the storm was negative, not in terms of sentiment towards North Carolina, but in terms of what was going on, the impact itself. We got on the news right away to get our story out, to talk about how there are still areas of Western North Carolina, of the North Carolina mountains, that are open and needing visitors. So, like Heather talked about, this storm did not impact the same parts of North Carolina the same way. So, there were still parts, believe it or not, of Western North Carolina that were open that needed visitation. But the news was that North Carolina, and you'll see in a minute, North Carolina in total was wiped out. Oh, I didn't mean to hit that. Sorry. Hang on. Let me see if I didn't mean to hit the actual newscast. Let's see. Oh, I apologize. Let me see if I can stop sharing and reshare for a second. Must have just clicked on the wrong part of that slide. Here we go. Nope. Hmm. Oops, I apologize. Let's see if I can get it past that. Can you, Denise, tell me if you're seeing a map or you're seeing Good Morning America? You're seeing the map. Okay, I'm seeing the wrong slide on my side. So let me move back up. So what we did was, in terms of partner reach and communications, we, of course, recommended areas of the state to not travel in, and noted those areas that were open and welcoming to travelers. So one of the problems we found was the perceptions, and that, the perceptions, and I'll talk a little bit more about the research and how we found that out. But we jumped in right away to have weekly phone calls with partners to direct visitors via our website to where that they needed to visit, where they could visit. Here we go. Okay, so those of you who may not be as familiar with North Carolina geography, as we are, of course, here's where the majority of the damage occurred. If you look at the inset map here, this is in red. This is where the majority of the damage occurred. So it's a large swath of Western North Carolina, agreeably, but you could see this area, the very far southwest, the Cherokee, the Smoky Mountains, was not as impacted. And they still needed those visitors. They still needed that visitor spending, particularly in this very crucial time of year for our mountains, for our Western North Carolina. So this statewide view is an interactive travel advisory map that we provided on our website to prospective visitors to give them a better understanding of those areas most affected by Hurricane Helene, and then those less affected. So when zooming into the map on our website, you could note which we're going to, how to contact that county's destination marketing organization, where they could get even more local information. So, in addition to our economic research, we knew that it would be important to understand what the perceptions of those potential travelers were, as far as the status of recovery, so that we could adjust that marketing appropriately. So, we regularly work with SMARInsights, and it just so happened we had our regular wave of research coming up in mid-October, or in late October, I believe. We pushed that ahead and went into field early in mid-October, so that we could add some hurricane perception questions to get a quick understanding of perceptions and misperceptions, as you'll find, of the status of travel in Western North Carolina. So we fielded this in our core and our secondary markets, as well as several test markets, over the period of October 14th through 20th. So really just barely over 2 weeks after the storm. So what did we find? Again, fielded just after the hurricane hit in mid-October, or the hurricane hit in late September. We found this out. So inclusive of all of our markets, we looked at the change in preferred destination. It fell from 31% in August, so pre-hurricane, to just 27% in October. Of the 47% of respondents who were not at least somewhat likely to visit North Carolina in the next year, a third said it was because of concerns about hurricane damage from Helene. Across all markets, this netted to about 15% of travelers not likely to visit North Carolina in the next year because of storm damage. And by market, we found some interesting distinctions. By market, we found that Nashville residents were more interested in visiting um, visiting the area, but we do believe that many of them were interested in helping with recovery efforts, which is great. But we found that that was likely the reason for that spike there. DC and Orlando, two other really popular markets for our Western North Carolina, had more noticeable shifts downwards in terms of North Carolina being a preferred destination. And then by market, looking at the likelihood to visit in the next 12 months. This decrease was most seen in New York City, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the other South. And this is probably one of my soapboxes, but we also learned how prevalent lack of geographic knowledge is, and we understood the perceptions and misperceptions of hurricane damage and how prevalent they were and really continue to be. For instance, I won't go through all these, but only 22% of those in our markets thought that the central part of North Carolina was unaffected. No, it was not affected at all. So, but only 22% believed that. Only 32% thought that our coastal area was unaffected. I'll tell a quick story. Our director, Whit Tuttle, he had a call not long after the hurricane from someone who was really concerned about visiting. They were like, "Well, I guess we can't visit anymore." And he said, "Well, where are you coming?" And they said the Outer Banks. And it was like, "Oh my gosh, yeah." So North Carolina is 543 miles wide, and the Outer Banks is on the far east, and the Western North Carolina again is far west. So only 32% thought the beaches were unaffected. So we knew that we had a problem here. A third thought that much of the whole state was without power. So on. I realize this is difficult to read, but this was probably one of the most important pieces of data that we received from SMARI immediately after the hurricane. By market, we could understand the perceptions or the misperceptions and how they varied by market. So I don't expect you to be able to read this, but let me just give you a couple of examples here. As of mid-October, DC residents had a pretty positive perception of the impact to the state, even while they may have been incorrect in some assumptions. Atlanta had some negative perceptions, and knowing how close they are to the Western North Carolina market and how important Atlanta residents are during that time of year, particularly, these are the perceptions that we knew we would need to track and to consider when creating our messaging, our recovery messaging. So what do we do next? We knew from the research that I just showed you that there were a lot of misperceptions on the status of damage and recovery and that they varied by market. But knowing also that the majority of the state was not damaged by the storm and that these areas desperately needed visitation, we knew we needed to get back into market, whether it be our regular core campaign or some version of that campaign. Additional research that we did with SMARInsights allowed us to test some creative that would be used in the Piedmont, the middle part of our state, and the coastal region to reassure potential visitors that these regions were open and welcome to visitors. We were able to understand, the messaging needs for those areas not affected by the hurricane by testing some produce spots specifically for this recovery time. We also worked with MMGY on some sentiment research to help us understand how long to stay in market with this messaging and when it might be safe to switch back to our regular campaign. We did wait until after the elections last year to start that sentiment research. But what that did was help us understand the impact of visitors' feelings of safety and security in the area, gather insights on specific concerns like accessibility or infrastructure issues or even health risks, and also how the hurricane influenced perceptions of potential visitors. So very quickly, what we did was, it became apparent to us, as I showed you, that the southern part of the mountains of the far west were far less impacted, and they were ready to visit or to have visitors for that important travel season. So we did this very quickly. We did not have much time to get into field before the actual leaves started to change and the businesses needed visitors. So, destinations like the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Franklin and Nantahala, Highlands, along with Cherokee, Clay, Graham counties in the far west were included in this very quick Support North Carolina's Southern Mountains campaign, our fall campaign. So that was a very quick campaign. We also did some pre and post Hurricane Helene analysis of that reputation of sentiment online, and we saw that approximately 30-point decline in that net reputation score. So while storm-related conversations do sometimes feature positive narratives that that can benefit the destination. The persistent high proportion of references to the tragic events remained a negative driver. So ideally, we would like to see mentions of these natural disaster events below 10% for several weeks, but this is in January. We're still seeing 22% of negative mentions of events with regards to North Carolina. So, what was our next steps? Armed with this early data, we quickly worked on our next steps. So, we did receive $5 million early on from the legislature in late October for a dedicated mountain recovery campaign, and we have since received some additional funding. I'll tell a little bit about that, and I hope I'm doing okay on time. Um, but looking to make a difference immediately and also with a view to extend our marketing through all 4 seasons. So to get through the anniversary of the storm, we looked at top markets of origin for the region for the different seasons and based on the level of funding to ensure the impact and the effectiveness. So what we did was look at those visitors who were most likely to visit Western North Carolina during the different seasons. And we chose North Carolina, South Carolina, so these contiguous states, plus Alabama, who our mountain partners told us was critically important to them during this time of year. Like Heather said, we don't usually market in-state, but we knew our in-state residents, who are the largest one state of visitation for North Carolina. About 35 to 40% of our overnight visitors come from in-state. We typically do not market to them, though. We knew that they were going to be important. Like Heather said, similar to the pandemic, we knew that they would be our first visitors back. And we knew planning a trip of shorter distance and perhaps length of stay would be better for us since we had to get this campaign out really quickly. Um, these recovery funds also provided flexibility within our core budget so that we were actually able to boost the Piedmont and coastal messaging and help address misperceptions about those regions while we were able to use the recovery money in the mountain region. So, this is just an example of one of our winter ads. I have some others, but let me tell you a little bit more about how we balanced our campaigns because again we've decided now we've got to get back into market for our coastal and Piedmont areas. So this is kind of how we balanced our brand campaign, which is called For Real, with the mountain recovery campaign moving forward, to help all parts of the state out. So a heavier investment in May and June we knew would help the perception challenges with those affected regions, and this also would allow us to pick up when the winter season left off. You can see again our core markets for mountain recovery, which we're continuing to pay attention to and shift as needed. Here are just some examples of our creative. So after we did that short fall season, we immediately launched into our holiday creative rotation, and we commenced, or what I don't know what the word is. We released, I guess, our tagline for our recovery campaign, which was our best way to get back is for you to come back. So you'll see we did not use our For Real tagline there. It's a couple-year-old campaign that we're really proud of and is doing great things, but it might be a little on the snarky side, and so we felt like it would not be sensitive for that area of the state as they were recovering. So that was our new tagline. So these are just some examples of our winter and holiday ads. We then moved in after the holiday leg of that flight wrapped. We switched to a pure winter creative. And again, we've never really been able to have a full seasonal campaign before. So this, helped with the snow season, the ski resorts areas, and the other beautiful places that you can see in the winter in North Carolina. So this ran through the end of February. We then, as mentioned, at the end of that month, we started marketing the spring in the mountains. And so this is just an example of our display paid search and paid social creative that we had out. Again, using that same tagline of our best way to get back is for you to come back. So what are some early results? These are really lots of data and big slides and probably only used for research purposes, but I wanted to show you what we looked at with our lodging data. So we looked at our STR data and our air DNA data because we really wanted to understand, what the lodging situation was. And so these are year-end numbers, and I'm just going to go really quickly through these. And if you just look at the demand, so this is the Smoky Mountain region, which remember, it didn't have that much effect in terms of damage. Hotel demand was up 2.5% for the year, but when you look at how that compares to the growth of home rentals in the darker color, home rentals increased just 0.2% in 2024, which is not online with what we had been seeing. But when you look at just Q4, you could see the hotels actually saw a 10% increase over Q4 previous year, while rentals were down nearly 12%. This implied to us that the hotels in this region were being used, but likely by non-visitors, such as evacuees from the hurricane or relief workers. So with home rentals down 11%, a more realistic representation of the impact of the storm could be estimated. And remember, this is a part of the state that was not impacted via damage from the storm. You also note that supply was down a little bit in Q4, which I'm not going to really talk about, but if you compare it to the annual supply growth of nearly 4%, you can see a big difference there. So that's the area not affected by the storm. If you look at the Asheville area where there was significant damage, we'll see a slightly different picture. Q4, both hotels and home rental bookings were down for the year and for the quarter. So the same explanation as the other region. Home rentals were down 26% in Q4, while hotel demand was down much less. Again, we realized that a lot of recovery workers and insurance adjusters and FEMA were staying in this area. So not what we would typically market to as visitors. And then just the third region, high country region, annual room demand was up. Home rental bookings for the year were flat, but down 14% in Q4. Again, it seems to indicate that hotels were being filled by non-visitors. And then with our annual wave of our SMARInsights ROI study, we were able to understand those first few months of that recovery campaign, because you remember we started around November, mid-November-ish. So these results here are just about 6 weeks. So it's through our regular ongoing awareness and effective study. We were already seeing results. So while overall Q4 visitation was down from normal years, our target investment in state, which again we don't usually do, saw nearly 80,000 visits from residents, in addition to 10,000 out-of-state visits. So remember, it's a little unusual for us to market in state, but we knew, again, we needed our residents to help get travel back to the area. With the investment in that in-state media in just over a month, we saw a 6% lift in in-state travel and nearly 80,000 influence trips, what we felt very positive about. By winter, we had also completed about 3 marketing kind of sentiment studies in our primary markets to understand intentions and perceptions of the state and mountain region. So you could see we asked people if they would be interested in visiting the western part of North Carolina or the mountain region of North Carolina. And for those who said no, we wanted to know why. And so you could see circled here the reasons for not being interested in visiting the region in the next year. So concern about the region's readiness was one, and concerned about Wi-Fi in the destination. By January, it wasn't too much of a concern, but the readiness of the destination and the accessibility of the destination, while they were much better by January, we were still concerned about those perceptions. We also looked at the same time, and I don't have a slide for, but the coastal region, and 7% of visitors who were not interested in the coastal region said it was because concerns of readiness after the hurricane, and 3% because of accessibility. So that we knew that there was still work to do in those non-affected regions. So how have perceptions changed, and how has our marketing affected these perceptions? So and the October data showed how prevalent the misconceptions or perceptions were. And these are just a few selected impact statements. For instance, 37% of those in our market were correct in their perception that some areas of the state were back to normal after the storm. By January, this percentage increased to 49%, so good movement there. But those who were exposed to our recovery campaign, the percentage reached 56%. So this was our SMARI research here telling us that. So if we can get them aware of our campaign, they are much more likely to have a correct and positive perception. So similarly, 22% of travelers in our markets believed that the central part of North Carolina was unaffected. But by January, this was up to 26%. Again, those who were exposed to our advertising, the percentage reached 38%. So it appeared to be working early on to combat those misperceptions. With that SMARI data and the sentiment data, we moved forward for plans for spring and summer. And with this in mind, you may recall I said we did some creative testing back in November to see if our brand campaign would resonate with audiences or if it would be the wrong tone. What those results indicated was that our core brand campaign messaging did resonate with audiences, and it was actually preferred over the more overt messaging, speaking to the state as being open for travel. So um, Piedmont and Coast, we were ready to get back to normal pretty much. The mountain recovery campaign with an aggressive spend in winter and spring flights. Our brand campaign has focused more on that Piedmont and Coast with our mountain recovery on the mountains. I thought I'd try to show you just a quick 15-second ad here. Can you hear that? Okay. No, you can't hear it.
Especially when you wind up here. For real, visit North Carolina.
Oh, I'm sorry you can't hear that, and I don't think we have a whole lot of time to for me to try to get that working. But you could always check our YouTube, our Visit and See YouTube page to see some of those ads. But you'll see as we move forward through the spring, we're getting back to our for real tagline, but we also have while we're not verbalizing it, as you can hear if you hear the study or the ad, we're still saying our best way to get back is for you to come back at this point in time. This is spring. So by now, we've completed 8 monthly tracking studies in our primary markets to understand those travel intentions. And while perceptions continue to improve, they're still not quite back to the levels that we would like. You can see highlighted here, there's hurricane-related reasons for not being interested in visiting the region. There's still concern about the readiness, though it's greatly improved from November of last year, but still indicates there's some ongoing concern for potential travelers. Verbatim, people said they would like to hear positive news as with regards to recovery efforts, or if I was able to confirm the region is ready for visitors, those type of comments. As for the coastal region, still 7% of the visitors interested in the coastal regions or not interested say it's because of their concern of readiness. So we still have some work to do there as well. But after looking at those vast improvements in visitor perceptions, we did feel the time was right to change our campaign messaging from our best way to get back is for you to come back to a new message. And it served us very well early in the recovery, but we knew it was time to get to something more inspiring. So the creative team came up with Rediscover the Unforgettable. And this is how the tagline and brand for the recovery campaign is moving forward. And so then we will begin to study the impact of this as we move forward. I'm afraid that this is not going to play the audio, which is really important because this is actually a 60-second video that we made featuring North Carolina musician Eric Church as the voiceover talent. So I would love for you to hear it. I don't think it's going to work, but you can find it online on our Visit and See YouTube channel. So I encourage you. He was such a great partner to North Carolina and to the Asheville area in terms of helping us with some recovery messaging. I'm going to move on past that because I do not think it will. Well, whoops, it's playing anyway. Okay, let's see if I can get through it really fast. Hopefully y'all be able to hear it. Oh, okay. Well, let me see here. Here we go. Okay, and then really quickly, I just have a couple more slides. The most recent results just show you a little bit about, what we're seeing top line performance. We're looking at total impressions November through the end of June, 389 million. Visits to the North Carolina Recovery Campaign landing page, nearly 2 million. And then you can see there the social engagements continued to perform well as well. We did extend our campaign thanks to an additional $5 million appropriation from the General Assembly. So we're not just going to go through October. We're going to go through the end of the calendar year. We're going to reallocate some of that in-state money that we've been using to more out-of-state media, expand our TV markets, increase budget for content creators, and more. So I try to rush through that. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we'll probably have time for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Marlise. And thank you, Heather.
Yeah. Yeah. We did have one more question for Marlise from Whitney. She asked, can you speak to any difference you saw with Helene versus hurricanes that have impacted the coast since this was more inland?
Yeah, so this was really a different incident, a different disaster. We in the past have done some short studies, but it tends not to take the coast quite as long to recover as we saw in the mountains, and they were usually, a little more isolated. So we have not done the level of research, but I can get with you offline, Whitney, and we can talk a little bit about some of the previous research we've done. We have not gone quite as in depth, nor have we received special funding for recovery campaigns prior to this storm. So I don't have a whole lot of data to share, but I can certainly share with you what I do have.
And do we have any more questions? Okay. Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you, Marlise, for talking about how you use data and disaster response. I think this is a super important topic at this point, especially as we see more natural disasters happening. And we greatly appreciate your time.